so many battles in the Dance of the Dragons that you can point to as being the most important, but for very different reasons. It really comes down to how you interpret the word. For example, I would argue that the second battle at Tumbleton is the most defining battle of the dance, because, well, the dragons literally danced. But in terms of the sheer impact left in its wake, for me it's hard to look past the importance of the Battle of the Gullet. Because, much like the Dance of the Dragons itself, it's very difficult to define who actually, truly won. Because on paper, it was a huge loss for the Greens, what should have been a war-ending loss, but somehow, due to the sheer brutality of the battle, the Blacks don't come out unscathed, with some of the damage done to them, directing the future course of the war, and Rhaenyra's downfall. For the Blacks, the Battle of the Gullet is a pure definition of a Pyrrhic victory. The cost to Rhaenyra and the Blacks is so high that it may as well have been a defeat. So in today's video, we're going to break down why the Gullet is such an important, if not the most important battle of the Dance of the Dragons, and how its impact really shaped the rest of the war and the outcome of it. If this be victory, I pray I never win another. Corlys Velaryon on the Gullet, Fire and Blood, the Dying of the Dragons, the Red Dragon and the Gold. The Dance of the Dragons is a very Riverlands, Crownlands focused war, and given King's Landing is the main prize, it makes sense that control of Blackwater Bay itself is vital. So at the start of the war we find ourselves with a situation wherein the Greens control King's Landing, and the Blacks via Corlys Velaryon have a firm grip over Blackwater Bay itself. Now, an interesting quirk with Westerosi history since Aegon's conquest is the royal fleet was effectively the Velaryon fleet, thanks to the close ties between House Velaryon and Targaryen. So in the event of a civil war, whatever side had the backing of House Velaryon had complete naval dominance. This creates a situation where the Greens control the capital and the mainland, while the Blacks control the bay and the area around it. This is fine for a while, but as King's Landing starts to run out of food and supplies, with not enough coming in from overland, the hold the Greens have on the capital begins to loosen as public discontent rises. Hence why trying to find an outcome to the Black control of Blackwater Bay was such a high priority for the then hand of the king, Otto Hightower, in the early days of the war. It's why he acted so quickly to try and broker a deal with the Triarchy, getting the Greens a navy and giving them a chance to break the Velaryon blockade. If they managed to do that, despite her superior number of dragon riders, it would be near on impossible for Rhaenyra to get a strong foothold that she desperately needed to actually win the war. So, while Otto Hightower's plan was a bit of a Hail Mary, and he did lose the support of Aegon II, who wanted quicker action to be taken, Otto did do the right thing, and it did pay off in the end. I think it's fair to say that while Criston Cole was a very good battle commander, and he wasn't an awful hand, but not allowing Otto Hightower's plan to play out was a huge oversight by King Aegon. So yeah, control of Blackwater Bay was if anything more important than control of the capital itself at this stage in the war. Holding King's Landing without the bay would be a huge logistical issue for either side, hence why the Battle of the Gullet was the first major offensive for the Blacks during the war. Now, the actual Battle of the Gullet itself seems somewhat a bit unexpected from the point of view of the Blacks. They knew that the Greens had no naval power, so were very much focused on the blockade itself. If the Triarchy fleet had actually managed to pull off a true sneak attack, while it would have been a huge task for them to overcome the sheer size of the Velaryon fleet, as well as 5 dragon riders on standby, it would have been an even closer run affair. But thanks to Prince Aegon the Younger, the Blacks were forewarned of the coming attack, and thus were able to prepare and be ready with dragons from the get-go. But even so, the tactics the Triarchy would employ by splitting the fleet, with one half taking the full force of the damage of the dragons, while the other sneak attacking Driftmark directly, ensured that no matter the outcome of the battle, the losses for both sides would be huge and damaging beyond repair. Now, I want to circle back the Aegon the Younger aspect of this for a brief moment. because again, the impact of this gets greatly overlooked. Because a part of warfare is also the psychological and mental effects of it. Aegon the Younger and Prince Viserys were being taken aboard a gay abandoned to the safety of Pentos and the Free Cities while the war was fought. In doing so, they run into the incoming Triarchy fleet. Prince Viserys is lost and presumed dead at this point, and Aegon the Younger just about makes it back to Dragonstone on his dying dragon, able to warn of the incoming attack. Now, everyone believes Prince Viserys is dead, and after the loss of Lucerys weeks prior, and now, seemingly the loss of her younger son shortly after the stillbirth of Visenya, it's a huge personal loss for Rhaenyra, and very much sets her on the path towards her sad mental decline over the course of the war as she loses more and more people close to her. We also then have Jacaerys, whom is effectively commanding the Dragon Riders. He's entering the battle with this huge mental anguish over losing another brother, and maybe this anger clouding some of his better judgment during the battle. So, while the loss of Prince Viserys happens prior to the actual battle itself, the impact of it on the Blacks psychologically cannot be understated. It's almost as important as the Greens losing the element of surprise. The dance was a war unlike any other fought in the long history of the Seven Kingdoms. Though armies marched and met in savage battles, much of the slaughter took place on water, and especially in the air, as dragon fought dragon with tooth and claw and flame. It was a war marked by stealth, murder and betrayal as well, a war fought in shadows and stairwells, council chambers and castle yards, with knives, lies and poison. The writings of Archmaester Gullet, Fire and Blood, the dying of the dragons, the blacks and the greens. I think the way Fire and Blood is written, the sheer scale of the battle doesn't come across, and as a result you don't understand how much of an advantage the blacks found themselves in after the greens lost the element of surprise. The Triarchy fleet was made up of 90 warships, filled with sailors and pirates, with a lot of combat experience fighting between themselves and Daemon and Corlys in the Stepstones for years. Importantly, they had experience fighting dragons. It's clear from how the Gullet panned out that this was always the plan of attack, for one arm of the fleet to take on the Velaryon blockade directly, while the second half bluffed an attack on Dragonstone, but bypassing it and taking Driftmark unaware. The Blacks, on the other hand, had a total of 186 warships, all fully crewed, and with the knowledge of the coming attack. Corlys Velaryon was a well-seasoned commander, and the best sailor of his generation. They also had 5 Dragon Riders, Jace with Vermax, Hugh Hammer with Vermithor, Off-White on Silverwing, Nettles with Sheepstealer, and Adam of Hull on Seasmoke. On paper, it's very hard to see an outcome where the Triarchy comes out of the Battle of the Gullet with a victory, yet both sides would claim so, which speaks to just how much of a mess the Blacks made of a seemingly easy win. What I love about the Battle of the Gullet is for the first time we have 5 dragons all active at the same moment. They absolutely decimate the Triarchy fleet, burning countless ships with ease. Out of the 90 ships that entered the Gullet, only 28 make it back past the Stepstones, most of them suspiciously belonging to the Lyseni, almost as if the Lyseni had held themselves back intentionally. It really kind of gives you an idea of just how powerful old Valyria really was, if this is the kind of damage only 5 Dragon Riders could do. It's no wonder it was the greatest and largest empire in the known world. So it seems, just looking at the numbers, that the Blacks clearly won the battle. So how can this clear victory turn into a Pyrrhic victory, where the Greens can claim a form of positive outcome? In theory, any tangible hopes of the Greens winning the war should have ended right here and now. 2, maybe 3 huge losses for the Blacks that has a huge knock-on effect for the rest of the war, and allows for Rhaenyra's eventual downfall and mental decline occur at the Gullet. Having 5 Dragon Riders in the battle was a huge thing for the Blacks, the odds very much in their favour. Yet, not only did they lose a Dragon Rider, but he was Rhaenyra's eldest son and heir, Jacaerys Velaryon. We don't know for 100% sure why Jace acted as recklessly as he did during the battle, but when victory was at hand, Jace and Vermax flew way too low and were punished for it when Vermax was fatally hit by the Triarchy with some kind of scorpion bolt that dragged him into the sea, with Jace dying with his dragon. All of this highlights just how inexperienced the dragon riders for the Blacks were in terms of not only dragon riding but general combat experience. Jace was the only one of them who had been a dragon rider for more than a few weeks. But still, his lack of combat experience really showed here. A dragon does not make you invincible, just as both Rhaenys Targaryens learned in the Sands of Dawn and at Rook's Rest. Jace's foe, the Triarchy, had years of experience fighting Daemon and his own dragon Caraxes in the Stepstones. While they never got Daemon, they learned the tactics needed to kill a dragon, or at least keep it at a distance. Jace, in his overconfidence and inexperience, gave them an opening that they needed. The death of Jace would be a huge loss for Rhaenyra, being not only her eldest child, but the third child lost in a matter of weeks. 4 if you're counting the stillbirth of Visenya. The loss of her children is at the core of Rhaenyra Targaryen's rapid and sad mental decline, and what takes her down the path of being dubbed Maegor with Teats once she does take King's Landing. The Velaryon fleet did take some huge losses, despite them outnumbering the Triarchy massively, losing 1/3 of their ships. But it was not the loss of the ships that was the real issue. They still had naval supremacy in the Gullet. The real loss would be the sack of Driftmark, and the personal damage done to Corlys Velaryon. The sack of Driftmark was utterly brutal. Spicetown was destroyed, never to return to its former glory. In fact, you can say the same for Driftmark as a whole. It never recovered from the Dance of the Dragons. House Velaryon itself was also damaged badly. They were a powerful and rich house before Corlys Velaryon, but the Sea Snake himself took that to a whole different level, even rivaling the power and riches of the likes of House Lannister. All of this was lost when Driftmark was sacked, and more importantly, High Tide was burned, with much of the treasure that Corlys Velaryon had brought back from Essos either looted or destroyed. So yeah, House Velaryon would recover somewhat post-dance, but never to the level they once reached. Corlys Velaryon was a man who cared deeply about his legacy, and in one single battle his life's work was destroyed. I really believe it was the damage caused by the Gullet that began Corlys Velaryon's path to Turning Cloak. It wasn't the only reason, but it certainly set him down that road. I think it's likely had Driftmark not been sacked, Corlys may have remained loyal to Rhaenyra to the bitter end. But then again, it was Rhaenyra's paranoia about the traitors that led her to arrest Corlys in the first place, something that may or may not have happened regardless of the outcome of the Gullet, given it was very much to do with the Dragonseeds. I think when you read the wiki page, or a summary of the Dance of the Dragons, the impact the loss of her sons has on Rhaenyra's mental health kinda gets lost in the shuffle. It almost comes across that it was the death of Joffrey later on, where that really sent her into her depressive spiral. But the truth is, it began with the death of Lucerys, then the stillbirth of Visenya. But because of the nature of the war, she didn't have time to mourn or grieve those losses, and if anything, it built her determination around getting revenge for the losses she suffered, which makes sense and makes a compelling story. But that double blow is followed by the seeming loss of Viserys, and hours later, the death of Jace. All of this is going to leave a mark on an already grieving mother. So when you remember that context, it does start to make sense that when Rhaenyra does actually take King's Landing, her decision making is compromised, fueled by grief for the loss of her children, but also that desire for revenge against those who made this war possible in the first place. Of course, when you later introduce the betrayal of the Dragonseeds and the death of Joffrey as she loses control of King's Landing, we end up with a situation where Rhaenyra's mental decline and erratic decision making makes a hell of a lot more sense than a summary makes out, and something Fire and Blood does a really good job at getting across to the reader, for what many fans consider just to be a history book. So if the Gullet happened differently, if Jace had not been killed, there's a chance that the betrayal of the Dragonseeds doesn't happen in the same way, with events in King's Landing once it falls to Rhaenyra happening very differently. Again, I think this also really highlights the impact the loss of Jace has to the Black faction as well. I think another thing that comes out of the Battle of the Gullet is how the reader views the Dragonseeds. There is definitely a divide between the 4 of them, and it really sets the stage for the role they play in the rest of the Dance of the Dragons. We have Ulf White and Hugh Hammer gleefully celebrating their victory after being knighted for their part, with little care for the loss of one of their commanders and comrades. Yet on the other hand, you have the likes of Nettles and Adam, who seemingly are deeply affected by the battle and the loss of Jace. seeking comfort from Corlys Velaryon, who himself has lost so much. The arrogance of Ulf and Hugh later results in them turning cloak at Tumbleton, a huge blow to Rhaenyra that pushes her paranoia further when she calls for the heads of Adam and Nettles, simply for being Dragonseeds. Adam and Nettles seem to learn the cost of war during the Battle of the Gullet, which is reflected in their actions. Nettles flies off with Daemon to try and take out Aemon One-Eye, taking this huge asset for the Greens off the table would all but end the war at this stage, given how few dragon riders they have and how powerful Aemon and Vhagar individually are. We can debate the relationship between Nettles and Daemon all day, but he outright defies Rhaenyra when she calls for Nettles' head. A huge moment considering the relationship between Rhaenyra and Daemon and how it's at the heart of the Black faction. Daemon then very much goes off and does his own thing, fighting Aemon one-on-one at the God's Eye. Adam, despite being called a traitor by his queen, fights on in her name, having a huge impact second Battle of Tumbleton as a result. All of these events and the way they happen come as a direct result of the Battle of the Gullet, and exactly how it played out. If you change the Gullet, the butterfly effect is that the rest of the war is unrecognisable. So this leaves us with a situation where both the Blacks and the Greens are able to call the Battle of the Gullet a victory for different reasons. The Blacks beat the Triarchy fleet on the field and would go on to capture King's Landing as a result, but at the same time they lost thousands of men, Driftmark and Jacaerys, not even mentioning the knock-on effect of these events. While the Greens failed in their main objective of breaking the blockade at the Gullet, they would call the damage done to Corlys Velaryon, his fleet and Driftmark a victory, with the death of Jace icing on the cake. Realistically, going into the Gullet, the hopes of the Triarchy were always slim, given their numbers compared to Corlys Velaryon's fleet. So in a way, I think they almost overachieved what was expected of them. So I think the better way to look at this is who lost the least. In this case, I would put an argument forward it was the Greens, because while they lost the battle itself, Rhaenyra and the Blacks would fumble their huge advantage and allow the Greens back into the war through general poor decisions, to the point where Rhaenyra ends up dead. Aegon II is on the Iron Throne, and for a brief moment, recognised as the King of Westeros. So yeah, no one won or lost the Battle of the Gullet, but it played a hell of an important role in the outcome of the war, and without it, things would have been very different for both the Blacks and the Greens. Battle of the Gullet perfectly reflects the complexities of the Dance of the Dragons. There are no winners, there are no losers. You can spin almost anything into a victory or defeat depending on your perspective.